Hello and welcome to the Google Science Fair 2015 Hangout on Air series. Google Science Fair is an online international science program for high school students around the world. I'm Mariette DiCristina. I'm the editor-in-chief of Scientific American and also the chief judge for the Google Science Fair. Now that the submission period is over, all of the sponsoring partners for Google Science Fair 2015, Scientific American, LEGO, Education, National Geographic, Virgin Galactic, and of course Google, are thrilled that on July 7th we will announce who the regional finalists are. Our guests today are Susana Martinez-Conde and Stephen Macknik. Susana is the director of the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience, and Steve is the director of the Laboratory of Translational Neuroscience, both at SUNY Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York, where they study various aspects of visual, sensory, and cognitive neuroscience. They are members of the Academy of Magical Arts, also known as the Magic Castle in Hollywood, the Magic Circle, the Society of American Magicians, and the International Brotherhood of Magicians, and they're authors of a fantastic book, Sleights of Mind, What the Neuroscience of Magic Reveals About Our Everyday Deceptions. Welcome, Susana and Steve.
Thank you, Mariette.
Hi, thank you.
It's so great to have you here. Our topic today is the neuroscience of magic. So we're going to be going back and forth between science and magic, and perhaps find some areas where the lines are a little blurred between them. I want to start off by asking each of you, first Susana and then Steve, about your work. Susana, can you tell the audience just what a neuroscientist does?
Well, there are different branches of neuroscience, but basically neuroscience gets at the study of the brain and the nervous system, and usually what does have to do with behavior and the clinics. In my particular case, I'm interested in visual and cognitive neuroscience. So that is how our brain gets us to see the world and to think about the world the way we do.
Thank you. Steve, tell us a little about what got you interested in our eyes and our visual connection to the brain.
Well, you know, I had a chemistry teacher in college, and he showed up one day, and he was very late for class, and he was embarrassed because he was stuck in traffic and he hadn't had time to prepare his course. So even though he's a quantum chemist, what the kind of research he actually did was vision research. And so he showed us a movie. His name was Gene Swickers. He showed us a movie, and it was the old-time movie, though, on actual film. So you know, he put the film on the actual projector, and it was.
Can you speak up just a tiny bit for us? Sorry, it's a little quiet.
It was an old-time movie projector, and he showed this documentary of what he did, and I was fascinated by how vision research worked and how it is that we saw and how it is that the brain received electrical signals and somehow made sense of the world from that. And so I was hooked from then on, basically from my first year in college.
That's awesome. So you've both studied what you call models of cognition in watching how audiences react to a stage magician. Can you tell us a little about that and what's going on in our brains when a magician is directing our attention? Susana, would you mind starting off on that?
So every magic trick or every magic performance is basically an experiment, and magicians have told us that themselves that they feel as if even though they're not following the scientific method themselves, every performance gives them an opportunity to see what works and what doesn't work for the audience. And magicians themselves develop their own hypothesis about it, and they call this field of magic magic theory. And these are similar to theories that we have as neuroscientists about how the brain works. So magic and neuroscience have a lot of common interests. And as neuroscientists, we wonder, like you said, what goes on in the brain of the audience. And there are many types of magic tricks, and some involve some more sensory processes, others involve attention and memory. But in terms of misdirecting the attention of the audience, what it comes down to is that the brain is the magician's confederate, because magicians don't do as much as misdirect us as actually direct our attention to what they want us to be perceiving at any given time and at any given point in space. And if the magician is successful in focusing our attention in that particular place, our brain does the rest of the job, which is to suppress everything else.
Suzanne, I'd like to follow up on just a couple of words that I heard you mention, and then I want to ask Steve a couple of questions. The first is you mentioned misdirecting audience attention, which is a word that I don't think a lot of us know. I know it's really common in the magic community. So would you just speak to what that means? And the second thing is you talked about the brain as being a confederate for the magician. So can you speak to both of those? Those are kind of magician terms, I think, that people maybe don't know so well.
Yes. So misdirection refers to how magicians drive our attention away from the method, which is the secret behind the magical effect, and towards the magical effect, which is what the magician wants the audience to perceive. And it used to be thought that magicians misdirect our attention, they manipulate our attention by distracting us away from the secret method. But this is not what's happening at the level of the brain. Rather, the magician is focusing our attention to what they want us to see, and the brain takes care of just not perceiving anything else, neglecting everything else, if you will. And that's what I mean that when I say that the brain is the magician's confederate, or the brain is the magician's accomplice. What magicians do is amazing, and they have great magicians that you see out there. They have many years of practice behind them. It's as if you think about a virtuoso playing violin or the piano. So what they do is wonderful, but even so, magic would not work if the brain wasn't suppressing everything else that the magician doesn't want us to pay attention to.
Thank you. So Steve, I want to follow up on a couple of those things with you there. First of all, I wonder a bit, Susanna used the word hypothesis and magic theory. Do the magicians really know about this aspect of how our brains work, or are they figuring it out intuitively? And what are some of the techniques that they use to manipulate attention in these ways, and misdirecting and so on?
Right. So, I mean, most magicians realize that magic is a psychological effect. And so that's for sure. As performers, they do understand that they're telling things to people, and all the clues are there to figure out everything at any given time, and yet people miss it because of the way that they behave. So in that sense, they know intuitively that they're dealing in neuroscience, but they rarely think of it in those terms. In fact, magic is kind of like music. So if you go and you see, for example, an orchestra play, there'll be 60 musicians on the stage. They're all amazing musicians, technical artists of their instrument, but usually none of them wrote the music, right? Usually there's very few musicians in the world that actually write the music for orchestras. In fact, often you're listening to the music that some guy wrote 400 or 500 years ago. So it's similar in magic in that there are very few magicians who actually invent the tricks, and most magicians are performers who take known tricks and may make it their own, but they're really technical performers and artists manipulating your brains for you in real time using kind of devices that other people have developed. And those musicians, though, who are like those magicians who are like the conductors, the ones who invent the tricks, they actually often realize that they're experimenting with the audience and that they're actually developing these things as a kind of experiment, and they think of it to themselves every time they go out that they do these things as an experiment. But it's very few magicians think in those terms.
So, Steve, one follow-up on that, which I like that idea. There's also, we talked about the role of the brain and what the magicians are doing, but isn't there also the other psychological aspect of that we kind of maybe want a little bit to be fooled? How does that play into where we allow our attention to be misdirected or directed?
Oh yeah, I mean, we definitely want to be fooled, but it's super fun. right? So, but you can think of it like, how great would it be to go run a 100-yard dash with Usain Bolt, right? It would be awesome. You have no chance, none, to even come close to the finish line by the time he crosses it, right? But it would be super fun. And it's the same kind of thing with the magician. You know, or at least you should, that you have no chance to know where that coin is, or what card it is that, or to keep the card that you chose from the magician's knowledge. Nevertheless, it's super interesting and fun to try and figure out what it is that they're doing, if not actual magic, and to get the feeling like you just saw something magical happen to you that's physically impossible. So, I mean, I think that's really what we're talking about is the fun aspect.
There's something else for wanting to be fooled from the point of view of the audience. So this is something that magicians are very aware of. And magicians will cultivate personas that are very likable. They will go on stage and they're very likable people that the audience empathizes with. And this is partly because from the magician's perspective, the trick is going to work much better if they're not alienating the audience. If the magician on purpose challenges the audience to find the tricks behind the magic, there are going to be more chances that the audience will do that, or at least some of the audience will. But when the magician establishes a connection with the audience so that the audience wants the magician to succeed, then they're going to be much less likely to keep looking behind the curtain.
So, Susana, let me follow up on that. So, speaking about a couple of very likable, I think, magicians, Penn and Teller, they often even show us exactly how they perform a trick, and yet we still, at least I can't, still necessarily be able to follow it when they do it. Is that really great skill on their part? Is it another aspect of how our brains work, or it's all these things sort of conspiring, let's say, against us or with us to enjoy that illusion?
Well, there are a couple of elements. I think some magicians, I think Penn and Teller are an example, and that and we as mostly consumers of magic, Steve and I think of this, that by knowing how a magic trick is performed, that is not necessarily going to diminish your enjoyment of the trick, but may make you even more intrigued and more amazed by it. But something that so that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that sometimes what gets revealed as part of a magic performance is a bit misleading, and it's not necessarily or not completely the way that the trick is done or is usually done.
I wouldn't say that Penn and Teller often show you exactly how the trick gets done. I would say Penn and Teller often seem to show you exactly how the trick gets done.
But having said that, the magic trick that they do that is one of their signature magic tricks, and we actually wrote a paper about it that was published in the journal PRJ. This is, they do the cups and balls routine, and this is a magic trick that dates back to the times of the Romans, and is typically performed with 3 inverted cups, and balls appear and disappear from the cups. And Penn and Teller do this with transparent cups. So the level of skill that you need to pull that off, regardless of how much they choose to reveal or not, but just doing it with transparent cups, that's an amazing feat by itself.
So that's, Susana, that's a great segue, I